I remember the exact morning it happened. Not because the sky was any different, or the birds sang any louder, but because the ground was wet in places it never should have been. I walked out to check the western boundary of my property, same as I did every Sunday, coffee and hand boots still damp from dew. That's when I saw it. The river, the one that had run for generations behind the tree line, cutting neatly through the edge of the county, predictable and quiet, was now roaring directly through my lower pasture. It wasn't a trickle or overflow from a storm. This was a deliberate diversion. Stone riprap had been laid. Bulldozer tracks scarred the banks. Concrete drainage culverts gleamed under the sun, fresh as open wounds. The river had been moved. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a city project that overshot its mark. Maybe some flood control rerouting that got redirected mid-construction. But the sign near the new culvert cleared that illusion fast. Approved by Willow Creek Estates HOA River Diversion and Water Management Improvement Project, Phase 1. I stood there on my own land, staring at that sign as if it were a tombstone. My boots sank into soggy earth that used to hold alfalfa and spring onions. A dozen rows of my late-season greens had already drowned their leaves, floating like lily pads in brown water. I called the HOA immediately, got dumped to voicemail. I drove to the clubhouse, got stonewalled by a young clerk who wouldn't even make eye contact, only repeated, "You'll have to put it in writing, sir." I put it in writing 3 times. They never responded. Instead, 2 days later, I got a letter slid under my door. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from any department that handled zoning or watershed management. It was from the HOA's attorney. "Dear Mr. Tanner, your recent inquiries regarding the river diversion project fall outside the scope of your HOA privileges. The board's environmental consultants have approved the redirection under subsection 9B of the HOA master plan. Any unauthorized entry into the construction zone will be considered trespassing and referred to county law enforcement." That's how I found out that my own field was now considered their construction zone. It was like watching someone break into your house and then sue you for walking in your own living room. You see, my land sits on the edge of Willow Creek Estates. I don't live in the HOA, not technically. My property predates it by about 80 years. My grandfather settled here after coming back from World War II. He planted every tree on that land with his own hands and carved an irrigation ditch that fed our fields from the natural bends of the original river. That river was as much a part of our family as the soil itself. But when Willow Creek Estates was built 30 years ago, the developers managed to wrap their HOA boundary around my land. They didn't own me, but they sure as hell wanted to. For years, they tried to buy us out, offered absurd sums for expansion opportunities. Then they switched tactics. Noise complaints, fines, even tried to get my old barn classified as a visual hazard, but nothing ever stuck. Until now. Now they'd found a way to literally go around me. They couldn't take my land, so they took the water instead. And without that water, my crops would fail. My property value would plummet. The field would flood in spring, parch in summer. And once it was ruined enough, they'd swoop in, offer to reclaim it, and fold me into their HOA by default. That was the plan. It had to be. What they didn't count on was that I'd keep walking that pasture, that I'd photograph every inch of it, that I'd still have my old army buddy in the water engineering department down at City Hall. His name's Felix. We served in Afghanistan together. I called him that same afternoon. He met me on site the next morning, bright and early, with a clipboard and a look that said he'd seen this kind of thing before. "They didn't get this cleared through us," he muttered after 20 minutes of surveying. "Not properly." What does that mean? It means someone skipped a few steps, maybe forged a few stamps. I asked him if it was enough to stop them. "Not yet," he said, "but maybe enough to make them sweat." He gave me copies of old watershed maps, city blueprints, and a contact at the Environmental Review Office. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Still, that didn't stop the water. Every morning I walked the field, I saw more damage. Soil erosion, crop rot, standing pools where mosquitoes were already starting to breed. The wooden posts marking my property line had begun to lean their bases, eaten away by constant wet. I tried to dam the flow with sandbags. The HOA sent a cease and desist letter the next day. I tried to meet with the board at their monthly meeting. They refused to add me to the agenda. I filed a grievance with the county. They told me if the HOA had permits on file, it would be a civil matter. So I was left alone watching my land die, while the HOA congratulated themselves on a successful flood mitigation strategy that redirected nature into someone else's life. They called it progress. I called it war. And I had no idea how far I'd have to go to fight it, or how much nature had in store for them in return. By the second week, the field no longer smelled like earth. It smelled like rot. The onions had collapsed inward, soft and slimy at the base. The spinach was curling at the edges, turning yellow, then black. Even the stubborn kale, usually the last to give up, was browning and breaking underfoot. My boots made a wet squelch every time I crossed what used to be dry rows. I hadn't cried in years, not since my wife passed. But standing in that dying field, with the morning sun pouring gold over acres of loss, I felt something buckle inside me. Not a sob, not a wail. Just this slow, tight collapse behind the ribs, like something sacred had been crushed and no one else even knew. I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, time-stamped observations. Each crop affected, each section drowned, each new erosion point creeping closer to the eastern fence. I cataloged it all, desperate to build a case, if not for court, then for truth. But truth didn't seem to matter much in Willow Creek. I went to the next city planning meeting, public comment section. Waited in line behind a teenager proposing a skate park and a woman demanding someone do something about her neighbor's wind chimes. When I finally stood to speak, I laid out every detail: the unauthorized river diversion, the damage to my property, the forged signatures Felix hinted at. The city clerk nodded along politely. One of the council members, a younger man with slicked back hair and 2 white teeth, glanced down at his notes, then asked, "Do you have any proof the HOA's actions directly caused the crop damage?" I stared at him. "Yes," I said. "The river moved across my land. It wasn't there before. It is now. That's not hypothetical." He raised an eyebrow. "But has a licensed environmental assessor documented the specific cause-effect correlation between the HOA's project and your agricultural losses?" Felix had warned me about this. "It's not enough for your house to be burning," he said. "You have to prove who lit the match, what kind of match it was, and whether or not you had insurance against match-lit fires." They smiled, thanked me for my time, and moved on to the next speaker. A week later, I got a visit from a man in a blazer carrying a branded folder. He introduced himself as Blake Thorne, a liaison for the Willow Creek HOA Legal Affairs Committee. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "I understand there's been some frustration," he began, all oily charm, and practiced empathy. "The river diversion project is a sensitive topic, but our records show it was approved by both the HOA Engineering Subcommittee and a certified hydrologist." I asked him for the name of that hydrologist. He said that information was internal. I asked for the original permit. He said it was on file with the appropriate departments. I asked what the hell gave them the right to move a river across my land without so much as a phone call. His smile tightened. Technically, the segment rerouted lies within a shared utility corridor as defined under the 1989 Plat Amendment. That gives us certain allowances under easement law. Section 4A to be specific. "I didn't sign any 1989 Plat Amendment," I said. "No," he agreed. "Your grandfather did. When the county redrew the basin maps." I stared at him. That land had passed to me cleanly in 2002 with a full title review. I'd never seen any mention of utility corridors or easements. But Blake stood there like a man reading from a teleprompter, written in invisible ink, too confident for someone bluffing, too polished for someone honest. "Let me put it simply, Mr. Tanner," he said, closing his folder. "You're not going to win this, and if you keep trying to rally the neighborhood or stir up noise with the city, we'll have no choice but to pursue action for interference." Interference with what? Our legally approved project. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a whiskey glass, sweating into a stack of legal printouts. I felt something unfamiliar clawing at the back of my throat, not just anger, not just grief. Silencing. They weren't just killing my land, they were trying to erase my voice. The next day, I posted in the town's local Facebook group. Simple message, 1 photo, the flooded field. Caption: HOA rerouted the river. My crops are gone. Did anyone else get asked? Comments came slow at first, then a trickle, then a flood. Some said they had no idea. Some mentioned they'd seen trucks weeks ago, but assumed it was county work. A retired woman down the block said she was promised less mosquito risk and increased property values. Someone else recalled a vague survey they'd gotten months back phrased so generically they hadn't realized it meant actual construction. And then came the private messages. One from a former board member who stepped down 6 months ago. You need to look at the consultant report from last October. They hired a guy named Darren Kravitz, not licensed in-state. Sketchy credentials. I left because of that project. Check the HOA meeting minutes. October 12th. I found the minutes. It wasn't hard. They were required to be public. Buried in 2 hours of budget discussion and pool maintenance chatter was a single sentence. Our board unanimously approved Phase 1 of the river diversion project under the recommendation of Kravitz Environmental. No details, no attachments, no maps, no debate. I Googled Kravitz Environmental. The firm had no physical office. The website was a single page with vague copy and a non-functioning contact form. The team photo was a stock image. I reverse searched. It appeared on 4 other sites, including a life coaching business and a law firm in Michigan. They'd hired a ghost firm to justify the project. Suddenly my voice didn't feel so small. I printed everything. Screenshots, meeting minutes, satellite images from before and after the diversion Kravitz's fake website. But before I could deliver it to the city, something else arrived. A notice of violation from the HOA taped to my gate. It claimed I had erected unauthorized structures impeding drainage, meaning the sandbags I placed to stop the river, and that I owed $1,200 in fines. They were drowning me in every way they could, water silence, bureaucracy. And I was about to find out just how far they'd go to shut me up. The permit was fake. I didn't want to believe it at first because if it were fake, then this was no longer a bureaucratic screw-up. It was fraud, plain and simple. And fraud meant something darker intent. They hadn't just diverted a river to protect their assets or fix flooding, they'd built a lie deep enough to hold back truth itself. But Felix confirmed it 3 days later. He met me in the back parking lot behind City Hall, a manila envelope tucked under his arm, eyes darting toward every security camera. I shouldn't be showing you this, he said, but you're right. Inside the envelope were 2 things, a scanned copy of the supposed permit and a chain of internal emails between the HOA's legal team and a mid-level employee at the city's Department of Water and Planning. The permit, dated 8 months ago, bore the seal of the city's Environmental Review Board, but the font was wrong. The signature block listed an official who hadn't worked for the city in 4 years. And worst of all, it was missing a third-party stamp required for any hydrological alteration over half an acre. The city would never have approved a river diversion without it. Someone used an old template, Felix muttered. Probably got their hands on a copy of a legit permit from another project and doctored it to look official. But the city signed off on it, I asked, already knowing the answer. Not really. Look at this. He flipped to the emails. This woman, Samantha Ling, was a junior admin. She didn't realize they hadn't submitted the hydrological addendum. She processed the application as complete and pushed it through to archives. No one double-checked. And now it's in the system, which means unless someone files a formal complaint, it sits there as if it's real. So that's what I did. I filed the complaint. I printed every form attached, every photograph, timestamp, satellite image, and sworn statement I could gather. I walked it in myself, handed it to the intake clerk, and asked for a receipt. Then I waited. 3 days passed. No call. No update. On the 4th day, I received an email, not from the city, but from the HOA's law firm. Subject line: cease and desist defamation and harassment. They accused me of spreading false claims to city officials, endangering public safety by interfering with water management and violating neighborhood codes by tampering with approved infrastructure. The letter was 12 pages long. It ended with a warning that if I didn't withdraw my complaint within 10 business days, they would seek damages and injunctive relief. They weren't just trying to silence me anymore. They were trying to crush me. I forwarded the email to Felix. He replied with a single sentence. Where now? That night, I sat in my shed, the old one behind the barn, where my grandfather used to sharpen his tools and roll cigarettes on the workbench. I opened the box I hadn't touched in over a decade. It still smelled like engine grease and pine wood. Inside was my uniform. Army Corps of Engineers, Lieutenant. my unit patch, old rank pins. Beneath that was the binder, my service record. And tucked inside, that yellowed, brittle but intact, was a letter of recommendation from my CO. And 2 cards, one for a structural engineer I worked with on a flood control mission in Missouri, and one for a lawyer who'd helped veterans fight wrongful property seizures. I called the lawyer first. Her name was Lana Ridge. And when she answered, her voice was calm but sharp, like someone who could take apart a deposition blindfolded. I explained everything in 15 minutes. She asked only one question at the end. Do you have the fake permit? Yes. And the original riverbed maps? Yes. Then they're screwed. Let's go to war. She filed a pre-litigation complaint within 48 hours, accusing the HOA of fraudulent misrepresentation, unlawful land alteration, and violation of state water safety codes. She also submitted an injunction request to freeze any further construction until the issue was resolved. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore, and the HOA didn't like that. 2 nights later, someone slashed the tires on my truck. I had cameras, grainy footage, 2 silhouettes in hoodies, one of them clearly laughing as they cut the rubber, then flipping off the lens. I sent the footage to the sheriff's office, filed a report. No arrests were made. The next morning, I found my mailbox lying in the ditch, bent in half like a crushed beer can. Inside it, a single note. I brought the note to Lana. She didn't flinch. We'll file a report. Meanwhile, this helps us. Shows intent to intimidate. A week later, we got a letter from the city. The official kind. Blue seal, certified mail. They had reviewed the permit, and they agreed it was invalid. The diversion had never been legally approved. The city suspended all projects related to the HOA's Phase 1 and launched a formal audit into Kravitz Environmental and the HOA board's recent expenditures. We were making progress, but damage had already been done. The river still cut across my field. The crops were gone. The soil had been stripped so badly I could see the base clay in patches. Fixing it would take months, maybe years, and the HOA wasn't giving up. At their next board meeting, they stood behind a podium and claimed to be victims of administrative confusion, blaming the city for clerical errors. They denied forging anything. They blamed radical elements in the neighborhood for stirring panic. They said my actions were threatening the community's cohesion. But they were sweating. The fake consultant had vanished. Their attorney stopped answering media calls, and the city's audit was growing teeth. Still, something gnawed at me. The original river route, the one they'd abandoned, wasn't just safer, it was essential. And a storm was coming. Literally. Weather reports forecasted the heaviest rains in 5 years. The same kind of storm I'd seen during deployments. The kind that doesn't knock politely. It pounds on the door and doesn't care who's inside. And thanks to the HOA's greed and lies, the river no longer had its natural channel. It had a new one, right through their perfect little neighborhood. The wind always hits different before a big storm. It's not just stronger, it's heavier. The air feels swollen charged, like the sky is holding its breath. That morning I stepped outside and the air pressed against my skin like wet cloth. Even the birds had gone silent. The storm was coming. Every weather report said the same thing. Flash flood potential, Category 3 atmospheric river. They used words like inches per hour, saturated ground, unstable soil. But I didn't need meteorologists to tell me what was about to happen. I already knew, because I'd seen the maps. The old ones, the real ones. They'd been tucked inside my grandfather's barn wall since the 1950s, behind a loose plank he used to hide his whiskey from my grandmother. One night after the HOA's lies came out, I found myself tearing through that wall as if the answers might still be buried in the bones of the farm. And there they were, rolled into a canvas tube, 6 hand-drawn maps, dated from 1949 to 1983, showing the evolution of the watershed across our valley. Lines drawn in faded ink, elevation markers done with a steady engineer's hand, notes in the margins in my grandfather's unmistakable script. One riverbed unstable west of Enoch's Bluff. Erosion zone increases during spring thaw. Avoid trenching near Southern Bend. Clay shelf too shallow. Flash flooding here in 72. Washed out fence and cattle trough. I'd grown up hearing the stories how the river used to run wild in the 40s. carving new paths whenever it pleased until the Corps of Engineers stabilized the banks with stone and willow root. They left the east bend my field alone because it was high enough to survive minor swell, but low enough to absorb runoff without damage. It was a buffer zone, natural insurance, and now, thanks to the HOA, that buffer was gone. The river had been pushed west toward what used to be a shallow ravine running through Willow Creek Estates. They'd filled it in years ago when building homes, calling it the terraces. It looked picturesque, neat cul-de-sacs, flat lawns, dog parks. But underneath, it was a sponge, an engineered lie. I spent that afternoon walking the old paths, with the maps under my arm, GPS app, open on my phone, confirming what my grandfather had warned about decades ago. The ground along the terraces wasn't solid. It was sediment on clay, barely compacted, propped up by retaining walls that had hairline cracks even before the HOA diverted the river. And now that same river ran within 300 yards of those walls, with a storm that could drop 6 inches in one night. It wasn't just dangerous. It was a loaded gun safety off pointed straight at them. I tried again to warn them. I wrote a letter to the city's emergency services director. Attached photos of the old maps overlaid with the current satellite images annotated every vulnerable point. I emailed it, dropped off a printed copy, called and left 2 voicemails. No response. I walked into the HOA office myself. This time, no polite conversation. No pretending to be calm. "I'm telling you," I said to the manager behind the plexiglass, "if that river overflows, it won't hit my field first. It'll take out your foundations, the ones you built on, reclaimed sediment." He didn't even look up from his computer. "We're following city guidelines," he said. "If you continue trespassing or harassing staff, we'll call security." So I left. But I didn't stop. I sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood using addresses scraped from the local directory. Urgent river diversion will cause collapse in upcoming storm. Please see attached geological maps. Please evacuate if you're near the terraces. That's when the backlash hit. Within hours, I was banned from the Willow Creek Neighborhood Forum. Residents began accusing me of fear-mongering. One board member called me a bitter old man trying to sabotage property values. A few people thanked me in private, but even they said they were afraid to speak out publicly. I understood. The HOA ruled with charm and threat in equal measure. Pretty smiles backed by legal warnings. Community barbecues next to quietly mailed liens. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was listening. Because 2 days later, I got a knock on my door. It was a woman, mid-40s, nervous eyes. She introduced herself as Megan Halpern, a structural engineer who'd been contracted by the HOA 3 years ago to assess soil integrity before they built Phase 2 of the terraces. I quit the project, she said, after they refused to follow my recommendations. But I still have the report. She pulled it from her satchel. 63 pages. Technical language diagrams load tests core samples. Her conclusion on page 59. Recommend no construction west of line F3 until soil stabilization and drainage reinforcement are completed. Risk of subsoil collapse during high moisture events exceeds acceptable thresholds. The HOA had seen this, and they'd ignored it. "Why are you giving this to me now?" I asked. "Because you're the only one who hasn't shut up," she said. With Megan's report, my grandfather's maps, and Felix's city records, I now had 3 separate sources, pointing to the same conclusion. The HOA had knowingly built on unstable ground, diverted a river through it, and ignored all warnings. And now the storm was 36 hours away. I set up 2 trail cams along the bank where the river had already begun to erode through the new embankments, planted stakes to measure rise, put sandbags around the eastern corner of my barn just in case. The night before the storm, I didn't sleep. Not out of fear for myself, but because I knew that by sunrise, people who had mocked me, threatened me, sued me, could be underwater. And the worst part, it didn't have to happen. The rain began just after midnight. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It came down in sheets, thick and cold, smacking against the tin roof like a war drum. By 2 a.m., the gutters on my porch were overflowing. By 3, the trail cams I'd set up along the new riverbank were sending me live footage I didn't want to see. The water was rising fast. I dressed in layers, pulled on my waterproof boots, and slung my old military field bag over my shoulder. Inside was a flashlight, spare batteries, the printed reports, the maps, and a burner phone I'd been using to document everything. I wasn't just preparing for a flood. I was preparing for evidence. The power flickered twice before sunrise. I boiled coffee on my old propane stove and sat at the window watching the edge of my ruined field disappear under churning brown water. The river, swollen and furious, had burst past the stone embankments the HOA installed and was now chewing away at the dirt like an animal breaking through a fence. I sent the footage to Lana, my attorney. No words, just the file. She replied within minutes. This is damning. I'm filing for an emergency injunction and media disclosure. But the HOA beat us to the punch in the worst way. By 7 a.m., the neighborhood Facebook group exploded with photos of the damaged basements, flooding lawns, collapsing a retaining wall that had cracked straight through and sent an entire section of a backyard sliding into the street below. And the comments came flooding in with it. Why didn't the board warn us? I thought the new river route was supposed to prevent this. I remember someone trying to speak up. Was it that farmer guy? That farmer guy was me. But the HOA didn't apologize. They went on the offensive. By 9 a.m., a courier arrived at my door with a thick packet. Inside, a civil lawsuit accusing me of reckless dissemination of false information causing panic and reputational harm. A demand for damages exceeding $150,000. A temporary restraining order banning me from attending future HOA meetings or communicating directly with any board member. I almost laughed. They were suing me for being right too early. I called Lana. Her voice was tight, controlled rage. They're trying to shift the narrative, she said. They know the storm just proved you right. But they're counting on the noise, the panic, the cleanup, so no one pays attention to how this happened. But it is happening, I said. The water's about to breach. She paused. I'm calling the press. That afternoon, I stood at the edge of my field mud to my knees, holding a makeshift pole to mark the water line. I'd measured it at sunrise. It had risen 21 inches in less than 12 hours, and downstream it was worse. The embankments behind the terraces had started to buckle. 2 homeowners had already been evacuated by fire crews, and still the HOA hadn't issued a public alert. So I did. Using my burner phone, I recorded a video standing in front of the flooded bank, holding the old maps in one hand and Megan's engineering report in the other. I kept my voice steady. My name is Daniel Tanner. I'm not part of the HOA. I'm a landowner, a veteran, a farmer. For months, I've warned that this river diversion would lead to disaster. They called me crazy. They sued me, but now the water is here, and it's not going to stop. I ended the video with a shot of the house at the far end of the terraces, already half-submerged lawn chairs floating in the driveway. I posted it on every platform I could find. Within hours, it had over 30,000 views. Reporters started calling Lana. Local news ran a segment that night. Whistleblower warned HOA of flood risk months before disaster. They showed my footage side by side with HOA press releases. The contrast was damning. HOA president, Gregory Blanton, finally emerged puffy-eyed in a raincoat that looked far too clean and gave a brief statement in front of the clubhouse. The storm was unprecedented. No model predicted this level of flooding. Our board acted in good faith, based on professional recommendations. The reporter pressed him, "Did you know about the soil report from 2021? Are you aware Kravitz Environmental isn't a licensed firm? What about the forgery accusations regarding the permit?" Blanton walked away, but the damage was already done. By morning, at least 6 homes in the terraces were uninhabitable. The clubhouse basement had flooded to the ceiling. The walking trail along the ravine had collapsed, completely dragging 2 lampposts and a bench into the muddy current. And still the HOA kept spinning. They issued a mass email accusing me of instigating hysteria and warned residents not to engage with unverified sources spreading misinformation. They framed themselves as victims of weather, of bureaucracy, of slander. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. People who had never spoken to me before started showing up at my gate. A young couple from Sandpiper Lane brought me a box of supplies and said they were sorry for not believing me. An elderly man who'd voted for every HOA president for a decade shook my hand and said, "You tried. We didn't listen." And then Megan called. They're deleting records. What? The HOA's cloud server. Someone's been erasing minutes, project files, invoices. I still have some backups, but you need to move fast. I sent everything I had to Lana. We rushed to file a preservation order requesting that the court demand an immediate freeze on all HOA digital assets. And we got it. A judge granted the emergency motion citing sufficient cause to believe evidence relevant to a civil and criminal investigation may be at risk. The walls were closing in on them, but I knew they wouldn't go down easy. Sure enough, the next morning I found my back fence torn open. Not by floodwater, by bolt cutters. 2 of my goats were missing, one found injured, the other never found. It wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was retaliation. And still I didn't stop. Because by now the storm wasn't just in the clouds, it was in the courtrooms. And the HOA's lies were starting to drown just like the homes they thought they'd protected. The rain didn't stop. For 3 days straight, it came in waves, sometimes a misty drizzle, other times a torrential downpour that beat down on the rooftops like war drums. Gutters overflowed. Storm drains backed up. Trees leaned into the wind like old men trying not to fall. By day 2, the city declared a local state of emergency. By day 3, half the residents of the terraces were gone, either evacuated by fire rescue or packing their cars and leaving of their own accord. The streets, once manicured and pristine, now resembled muddy canals littered with floating mulch, splintered patio furniture, and more than one waterlogged HOA landscaping sign. And the river, the one they had tried to bend to their will, was no longer a river. It had become a force. It no longer followed the carved channel the HOA had bulldozed months earlier. That crude embankment was now gone. Washed out completely overnight. The trail cam on its pole snapped clean in half and dragged downstream with the rest of it. The water had found its own path, back to where it had always wanted to go. And that meant through them. I watched from the edge of my barn, standing under the awning, soaked to the knees in rain and mud. The flow twisted, surged, and hissed against the crumbling remains of decorative stone walls, backyard fences, and ornamental koi ponds. It wasn't just erosion. It was revenge. Nature had no interest in courtrooms, or lawsuits, or master plans. It simply remembered. And when you pushed it too far, it pushed back, hard. I took out my phone and began filming. This wasn't for clicks or drama. It was documentation, evidence. Every frame told a story that no amount of HOA PR spin could erase. Around 10 a.m., the back half of the Blanton property, the HOA president's own home, collapsed, literally. The support beams beneath the rear deck gave out first. Then came the sliding glass doors shattered by a wall of water and mud. The lawn folded inward like a trapdoor, and half the structure groaned before tipping backwards, swallowed into the churning flood. I stood there staring, unable to look away. He had sued me, threatened me, called me a liar and a lunatic. Now his $1 million home was floating. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to meet Lana at the courthouse. We had secured a special hearing to present new video evidence, and she wanted me there, even if just to look the judge in the eye while he watched the destruction unfold. But before we could even enter the building, we were intercepted. 2 county officials from the Department of Natural Resources waited in the hallway, clipboards in hand badges visible. "We'd like to speak with Mr. Tanner," one of them said. "Your complaint has triggered a multi-agency review." Lana narrowed her eyes. "On what grounds?" The man flipped a page on his clipboard. "On the grounds that the Willow Creek Estates HOA may have violated no less than 8 state water safety and construction codes, including illegal diversion of a protected waterway, forging of environmental impact documents, and obstruction of floodplain regulation." I didn't say anything at first. Then I asked, "What does that mean?" He looked at me and said calmly, "It means you were right." The hearing lasted less than an hour. We played the video, submitted the maps. Lana read the soil reports aloud, including Megan's original assessment and the city's permit audit. The judge, a silver-haired woman with deep crow's feet and a prosecutor's stare, barely said a word. At the end, she leaned forward and addressed the court clerk. "File a referral to the district attorney's office. This needs to be investigated for criminal misconduct." That night, the rain finally stopped. Not all at once, not dramatically, it just faded. The wind died. The thunder moved off into the distance. The clouds broke open and let a faint sliver of dusk light through like a thread of gold over the ruined valley. I stepped back out to the field where the water was beginning to recede. And what I saw brought tears to my eyes, not from sorrow, but from something deeper. The river, the real one, the one my grandfather used to kneel beside and dig out with his hands, was beginning to return. Not perfectly, not fully. But it had carved itself back toward its original channel, pulling away from the artificial route the HOA had forced it into. As if it knew where it belonged, as if it had been waiting. I walked to the stone marker we'd placed at the old bend years ago, the one with our family name carved into it. Tanner, 1946. Half submerged, covered in moss, but still there, still standing. And I stood beside it silent as the twilight settled. The river was back, but the fight wasn't over. That same evening, I received a call from Megan. "They've lawyered up," she said. "The HOA has hired a crisis management team and a private firm out of state. Word is they're going to try and pin the collapse on the city's storm infrastructure." Of course they would. They weren't built for accountability. They were built for control. But now the city had seen the truth. So had the press. And so had the people whose homes now sat in wreckage, their porcelain tile and fake marble countertops buried in 6 feet of river mud. They were angry, not just at the rain, at the lies, at the arrogance, at the law board. And they were starting to remember what I'd told them all along, that the earth always wins, that water always remembers, and that some things, like land, like legacy, should never be stolen because they will come back, one way or another. I didn't hear the sound when it happened. It was too far away across the ridge beyond the twisted trail that used to be a walking path, now just another casualty of the flood. But I felt it. The ground trembled beneath my boots. Not violently, like an earthquake, but like a deep, slow groan, a sigh from the earth itself. It moved through the soil like a warning, a long-held breath finally exhaled. And then came the call. Felix's voice on the other end was sharp, rushed, but steady. "It's gone," he said. The hill behind the terraces just gave way. The entire slope collapsed. My stomach dropped. "Casualties?" I asked. "No confirmed injuries. Most residents were already gone. But at least 8 homes were pulled down into the mud. The foundations failed. It was textbook lateral spread, the kind your grandfather warned about in that map. I stood in silence, staring out over my own flooded land. The water had begun to pull back, leaving slicks of mud and tangled roots behind. But even in its retreat, it felt watchful, like it wasn't finished yet. Felix sighed. "You should come see it yourself." By the time I reached the site, the scene looked like something out of a war zone. Police tape flapped in the wind. Emergency crews were everywhere, National Guard, fire department engineers in neon vests, combing through piles of debris with handheld scanners and drones. Reporters hovered at the edge of the cordon, pointing cameras at what used to be Willow Creek's most luxurious cul-de-sac. The hillside had sheared clean off. What remained of the 8 homes lay in jagged pieces at the bottom of a ravine, buried beneath 20 feet of soil and shattered concrete. The HOA board had tried to shore up that slope a year ago, with decorative retaining walls and shallow pilings, nothing near what was needed for the weight they were supporting. It was theater, cosmetics, veneer over weakness. Now it was rubble. I saw Megan across the way, in a hard hat and reflective vest, speaking with a group of geologists. She waved me over and handed me a printed sheet. It was the original warning she had submitted to the HOA 3 years earlier, stamped, signed, and highlighted. "Do not proceed with construction west of line F3. They'd ignored it. And now everything west of line F3 was in the ravine. This wasn't just greed, she said, voice flat. It was pride. They knew the risk. They didn't care. Felix joined us a moment later, mud splattered up to his shin's eyes, sunken from no sleep. "The state's sending in a geotechnical team," he said. "They're treating this as an engineering disaster, now not just flood damage. You've started something, Daniel." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. These homes, this neighborhood, it could have been saved. If someone had just listened. If the HOA board had taken one step back and asked the most basic question, should we? Instead, they chose to pave over warnings, to bully, sue, and intimidate until their reality was the only one that mattered. But nature doesn't care about your fantasy. It only responds to truth. And the truth was now carved into the land like a scar. The city held a press conference that night. I stood in the back, arms crossed, soaked in the smell of wet earth and splintered pine. The mayor, flanked by engineers and state officials, addressed a crowd of cameras. "We are launching a full investigation into the Willow Creek Estates HOA," she said. This includes their permitting process construction practices, environmental assessments, and any alleged forgeries connected to the river diversion project. Her voice hardened as she added, "We will hold accountable anyone whose negligence contributed to the destruction we've witnessed this week." Behind her on a stand was a large color aerial photo of the collapse. You could see the brake line, clean, cruel, final. A reporter asked whether criminal charges were being considered. She didn't hesitate. Yes, that word echoed in my ears all night. Yes, they would face consequences. Yes, the damage could no longer be hidden behind HOA memos and legal threats. Yes, the truth mattered. Back home, I reviewed the footage I had taken since day one my field drowned. The forged permit, the fake consultant, the diverted river roaring through my fence, Blanton's house collapsing into mud. It was all there. I copied the files onto 2 hard drives. One I gave to Lana, the other I locked in a fireproof safe under the floorboards of my shed. The next morning, I got a knock at my door. It wasn't the HOA. It was residents, a small group of them, some still in rain boots, others with red eyes and damp sleeves. They held casseroles, paper towels, bottled water, and something else, a handwritten note. It read, "We're sorry for not listening, for letting them do this. You tried to warn us. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we didn't deserve it." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, stepped aside, and let them in. Because we weren't just cleaning up a flood. We were rebuilding trust, one broken board at a time. They said the homes were built to last 100 years. Reinforced foundations, luxury materials, the best insulation money could buy. Every HOA brochure boasted about elevated construction standards and award-winning flood resilience. They used terms like eco-sustainability and modern engineering, sprinkled with photos of gleaming rooftops and manicured hedges. But when the water came, none of it mattered, because the homes didn't sink slowly or collapse with dignity. They floated, one by one like oversized plastic toys in a bathtub, their basements already waterlogged, their structures hollowed out from below. The ground didn't need to swallow them. The river lifted them away. It started with the house, at the edge of Larkspur Lane, a modern monstrosity with solar panels and a 3-car garage. At first, it simply tilted. The garage door bent backward as the foundation beneath cracked. Then the back corner rose just a few inches before the entire house shifted like it had grown legs. It pivoted slowly, groaning, and slid down what used to be a driveway, now a fast-moving brown torrent. It moved 20 feet before toppling sideways into the street. I watched the footage from a drone the local paper had deployed. No music, no narration, just the sounds of water and wood tearing apart. It was surreal. Within an hour, 3 more homes joined it. Walls peeled open, roofs twisted, furniture spilled out through shattered windows, leather couches, nursery cribs, high-end appliances, all reduced to flotsam. Blanton's house, the HOA president's pride and joy, was the last to go. It had resisted the longest, perched on a slight rise, and surrounded by a thick brick retaining wall he'd insisted was a fortress. I remember watching him oversee its construction months ago, barking at contractors about angles and mortar density, as if he were building a palace on the edge of an empire. Now that wall stood like a corral around a drowning horse. I was standing by the old riverbed, on my property, filming with my phone, when I saw it. The moment the base of the wall gave out with a low crunch, and the pressure behind it burst forward like a cannon blast. Blanton's house jerked, groaned, and then slid. Sideways, not backward, not downward, sideways, the way a boat might when it loses its rudder. It scraped against another house, tore down a telephone pole, and hit a tree so hard that one corner of the roof crumpled like paper. No one was inside. He'd fled 2 nights before after reporters began camping out on his lawn, and neighbors started yelling through his door. But the house stayed behind to pay the price. I heard that someone later found his HOA Board of Excellence award. Floating downstream, in a pile of wreckage, water-damaged frame, shattered, the gilded lettering peeling off like skin from a burn. I wish I could say I didn't feel anything watching it happen, but I did. I felt relief, not glee, not vengeance. Just the quiet, heavy relief that comes when the thing that's been pressing on your chest for months finally breaks apart. When the gaslighting ends. When truth is no longer a theory, but visible, undeniable. The news went national that night. Luxury homes swept away by flood after HOA redirected river. Engineers' warnings ignored before catastrophic collapse. Veteran landowner fights HOA, then nature fights back. They aired parts of my videos, interviewed Megan, showed stills from the reports Lana had filed. Even Felix, who usually avoided the spotlight like a plague, gave a brief statement. And people listened. That's when the phone calls started: journalists, legal watchdog groups, environmental regulators, even 2 producers from a documentary studio in Los Angeles. But I ignored most of them, because the next morning I got the call I'd been waiting for. The district attorney's office. They confirmed that a criminal investigation had begun. Grand jury subpoenas had already been issued. They were looking into fraud, reckless endangerment, and criminal negligence. The charges could include up to 20 years for some of the board members. Lana and I drove into town to meet with them. She carried a rolling briefcase full of hard drives and printed records. I carried a single envelope, the original hand-drawn map from my grandfather, laminated now with mud still caked along the fold lines. When the DA saw it, she asked, "This is where the river used to run." I nodded. "And this," she said, tapping the map, "is where they tried to make it go." I nodded again. She looked up at me, brow furrowed. "They moved it across your land without consent." I pointed to the stamp that had been forged. "They tried to bury me in paperwork and lawsuits, but the river didn't care about their paperwork." She leaned back, expression grim. "Neither do we." That afternoon, the city issued an emergency ordinance. The HOA was officially suspended. All board authority revoked. A third-party administrator appointed to oversee recovery. A hotline established for residents to submit claims of harassment, misconduct, or property loss due to the river diversion project. And suddenly the same people who once called me a troublemaker were lining up outside my barn with boxes. Photos, emails, HOA letters, secret recordings, threats, witness statements. It wasn't just about a river anymore. It was about power. How it gets abused. How it gets hidden behind friendly newsletters and block party BBQs. How the people who crave it most are often the ones who deserve it least. One woman, maybe 65, handed me a binder full of old HOA minutes. She whispered, "They fined me for planting daisies in my front yard. Said they weren't color appropriate. I've hated them ever since." Another man said they tried to evict his elderly mother for putting up wind chimes on her porch. They told her the sound was disruptive to community peace, he said. You know what's disruptive to peace? Losing your house to a flood you were never warned about. That evening, as the sun finally returned to Willow Creek for the first time in days, I sat on the back porch with Felix watching the light glint off pools of standing water across the field. The ground was wrecked, but it was mine again. No HOA officer, no legal letter, no smirking board president could take it from me now. I always said you were the stubborn one, Felix said, sipping from a chipped mug. And you always said they'd never listen, I replied. We both chuckled, then quiet. Then he asked, so what now? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the river gently moving now peacefully like a soldier returning to attention after chaos. And I said, now we let it flow. There's something quiet about vindication. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes like dawn, slow, certain, inevitable. The morning after the emergency ordinance suspended the Willow Creek HOA, I sat alone in my shed with the old safe cracked open. Inside, I laid everything out piece by piece, not just for me anymore. For the record, for history, for the investigators who would soon be knocking, asking not just what happened, but why. The footage, the files, the truth. It was all here. I'd saved everything obsessively, almost. Drone videos of the flooding, GoPro clips from the day the river first appeared in my pasture, cell phone images of erosion lines, broken culverts, and homes floating like driftwood. I'd made backups on 3 drives and even mailed one out of state to a cousin I trusted just in case things got ugly. And then there were the documents, emails from HOA board members leaked to me anonymously, internal memos referencing the permit discrepancy before it was ever approved, and minutes from a private meeting where Gregory Blanton joked, "Let the river soak Tanner's field. It's not like he uses it for anything useful." Lana had taken every file and indexed it. Color-coded, annotated, time-stamped. She'd compiled a report over 200 pages long built like a trial brief. Her paralegal said it was the tightest civilian case of HOA misconduct they'd ever seen. But to me, the most important piece wasn't even digital. It was paper, my grandfather's map. I framed it finally, hung it right above my workbench where his old level and hammer still sat. The lines he drew in 1953, the curve of the river, the warning about the bluff, the slope markers he walked and measured with only a transit level and a war veteran's eye, they'd all come true. He didn't have software or drones or engineers in his pocket. He had respect for the land. And now, finally, that respect was speaking louder than the HOA ever could. The district attorney's office moved fast. Within a week, subpoenas went out. Within 2 agents seized HOA servers. By the end of the month, 3 board members were indicted on charges including environmental fraud, reckless endangerment, falsification of public documents, and criminal negligence. Gregory Blanton was arrested in his country club driveway. The footage made the evening news, him in a windbreaker, hands behind his back, flanked by 2 deputies. His expression said everything: shock, disbelief, rage, but not once did it show remorse. I testified in front of the grand jury. So did Felix. So did Megan. We weren't alone. Over 20 residents came forward with stories, some small like excessive fines for kids' sidewalk chalk. Others heartbreaking like the widow who was evicted for installing a wheelchair ramp without board approval. The entire system had rotted. Not just the river diversion, but the culture of power without accountability, of governing by intimidation under the guise of community standards. And now finally it was all unraveling. The court ordered the HOA to pay damages. Not just to me, but to everyone impacted by the flood. Emergency funds were released for repairs. A local nonprofit partnered with the city to help displaced families find temporary housing. And as for the homes that had floated away, they became cautionary tales. Megan began consulting with other neighborhoods. Felix was promoted. Lana got invited to speak at a national summit on HOA reform. And me, I planted again. The field, after weeks of drying and careful regrading, was finally ready. I rented a tiller from the co-op, turned the soil slow and deep, feeling every clump of earth crumble under the blades. The first rows of onions went in early, then radishes, then spinach. For the first time in months, the ground didn't fight me. It welcomed me back. One afternoon, a young man parked his car at the edge of the pasture. He wore a shirt and tie, his shoes dusty from the walk down the hill. "You Tanner?" he asked. I nodded. He held up a press badge. "I'm doing a follow-up for the Times. About whistleblowers. About how a guy with a field full of mud and an old map took down an entire HOA. Mind if I ask a few questions?" I chuckled. "You can ask. Just don't call me a hero." "Why not?" I turned, looked out over the green stubble poking through the rows. Life returning from beneath ruin. Because I wasn't trying to save them. I was just trying to save what was already mine. He nodded, scribbled something, then asked, "What do you want people to remember about all this?" I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, "That truth has roots. You can bury it. You can flood it. But it'll find a way back up." Before he left, he asked to see the river. I took him down to the bend. We walked past the tree line where the flood scars still clung to the bark, where fence posts leaned like old men after battle. And there it was. The water calm, now moving slow, whispering through gravel like a lullaby. He took a photo. Then I took one too. For myself. Not for court, not for proof, but to remember the moment the earth forgave us. Because I hadn't just won. We had learned. Spring came late that year. The storm had churned the earth so deeply that the frost line lingered longer than usual, as if the land itself wasn't quite ready to let go of what had happened. But eventually, the sun stretched longer into the evenings. The birds returned, the river settled, and for the first time in nearly a year, my field bloomed again. I walked the edge of it one morning, the old walking stick my grandfather carved in my hand, the dew wetting the cuffs of my jeans. The rows were straight, tight, perfect. Kale sprouted strong. Onions peeked through in neat green curls. Even the stubborn radishes pushed up like they were proud to be here. It felt sacred. Not just because I'd fought for it, but because I'd earned it back. The river, once forced off course and made a tool of someone else's agenda, now ran alongside the field just as it had for generations. No culverts, no artificial embankments. Just the old bend, newly reshaped flowing soft against the southern rise. Felix helped restore it, so did Megan. Even some of the same city engineers who once ignored me showed up with maps, shovels, and apology in their eyes. We worked together not because a court ordered it, but because something bigger had shifted. Trust. The neighborhood changed too. The board was gone. A new community association was formed, smaller, more transparent, volunteer-based. No more fines for unapproved flower beds. No more threats over mailbox paint. People planted what they wanted. Kids played in front yards without their parents getting letters about noise ordinances. I started getting dinner invites. People brought over pie seedlings, handwritten thank you notes. Not because they had to, but because they finally saw what I'd been trying to protect all along. It was never about control. It was about belonging. One Sunday afternoon, I hosted a cookout. Nothing fancy. Just hot dogs, potato salad, and a folding table under the big sycamore tree. Felix brought ribs. Megan brought a homemade pie that could have won ribbons. Even the mayor stopped by for a plate and a handshake. We didn't talk about the lawsuits or the arrests. We talked about the river, its depth, its clarity. How in the evenings the sun hit it just right and made the water glow like glass full of gold. It's like it came home, someone said, and I nodded. Because that's exactly what happened. The HOA had tried to weaponize nature, to bend it, control it, monetize it. But nature doesn't forget. It remembers its path, its shape, its soul. Just like people do when they're pushed hard enough. Lana sent me an email that week. The final ruling had come in full damages awarded. HOA board members barred from holding administrative positions in any registered homeowners association for life. Civil fines issued. Some residents had already begun pooling together their payouts to rebuild a community center, this time in a safer spot on the hill. We want you to name it, one of them said to me. I laughed. Name it, why me? Because if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a community left. So I thought about it for a while, and I chose the Willow Bend Pavilion because it sat near the curve where the river finally turned home. And because willow means resilience. It bends but never breaks, just like we didn't. One morning, not long after I stood by the edge of the pasture again, watching a light fog roll over the earth. The breeze was cool, gentle. The kind that whispers, you made it. A kid rode past on his bike, splashing through a puddle, laughing with his whole chest. His parents waved from their porch, no tension in their shoulders. No HOA cameras blinking overhead. No clipboard-toting enforcers hiding behind bylaws. Just life. I walked to the riverbank and sat on the old stump I used to fish from as a boy. The water moved slow, steady, calm. I dipped my hand in. Cold. Clean. Right. And for the first time since the day I saw bulldozer tracks in my pasture, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Because this stillness, this rightness, wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was peace. Earned, not given. And it had returned just like the river. Not because someone permitted it, but because it had always belonged here. So had I. And now, finally, the land and I could rest together.